When someone pulls away, the natural instinct is to chase, explain, or demand clarity. But choosing silence instead can completely shift the situation. Ignoring isn't about revenge, it's about reclaiming emotional control, restoring self-respect, and allowing space to see things clearly. What happens next often reveals more than words ever could. When someone pulls away, the first instinct is often to question everything. What went wrong? What changed? And what can be done to fix it? But when the response is silence instead of pursuit, the balance immediately shifts. That shift in power dynamics is quiet but strong. The person who distanced themselves expected attention, emotion, maybe even a reaction rooted in fear of loss. Ignoring removes that expectation entirely. It interrupts the pattern they thought would play out and places emotional control back in your hands without a word. Pulling away usually comes from a place of assumed certainty. Certainty that interest is secured, that attention is guaranteed, that chasing will follow. When that assumption is challenged, the psychological footing changes. Suddenly, the one who withdrew is no longer the one dictating the pace, the tone, or the emotional direction. The power they held through distance dissolves, because distance only works when the other person tries to close the gap. Ignoring refuses to play that role. Silence creates an unexpected pause. It makes them confront the fact that pulling away doesn't automatically give them control. They don't get to decide when affection is offered and when it's withheld. When you don't react, you remove the emotional safety net they counted on. That alone can be jarring. They may begin to question whether the connection was as secure as they assumed. Internal doubts rise. Did the distance even matter? Was there ever real influence? Did silence mean strength rather than surrender? Ignoring also sends an unspoken message. Emotional energy is no longer being poured into uncertainty. Instead of trying to fix what someone else broke, the focus returns to self-respect and autonomy. That changes the narrative completely. Power is no longer placed in the hands of someone who chose to step back. It's reclaimed by the one who chose not to follow. The absence of reaction is often louder than confrontation. It creates a mirror they didn't expect to face. In that mirror, they see that their withdrawal didn't cause panic or desperation. They see someone who won't beg for clarity or compete for attention. That shift can trigger discomfort, curiosity, or even attraction because mystery replaces predictability. The dynamic changes further when silence continues. The person who pulled away may feel the loss of influence. What was once taken for granted now feels out of reach. And the longer silence holds, the more the power redistributes, not through manipulation, but through emotional self-possession. Ignoring is not passive, it's intentional. It says, without saying anything, that access is earned, not assumed. Curiosity is one of the strongest psychological triggers, and silence activates it in ways that words rarely can. When someone pulls away, they often believe they understand how the situation will unfold. They expect questions, emotional reactions, attempts to reconnect, or at the very least, visible confusion. But when the response is complete withdrawal of attention, it disrupts their expectations and replaces certainty with unanswered questions. That's when curiosity and confusion begin to surface. Silence makes people think. It forces the mind to fill in the blanks. Because there's no reassurance, no emotional feedback, and no validation to rely on. Instead of watching someone chase or seek explanation, they're suddenly left face to face with a quiet they didn't plan for. That quiet becomes a mental itch, difficult to ignore and impossible to fully understand. Thoughts start circling. Was interest ever real? Has something changed? Did the silence mean indifference or strength? They may not show it outwardly, but the mind naturally gravitates toward what it no longer controls. Confusion sets in because the script they assumed you'd follow has been abandoned. They're not being pursued or confronted, they're being met with nothing. And nothing can be unsettling, especially when attention was once easy to receive. The absence of response can feel heavier than direct confrontation, because it suggests that their actions didn't have the effect they counted on. It shows that the emotional impact they expected to create failed to land. Curiosity grows stronger when there's no clarity. They start comparing the silence to how others may have reacted in similar situations. even if they pulled away casually or without much thought. Being ignored in return triggers a kind of ego check. It introduces the idea that maybe they weren't as significant as they assume. The lack of reaction makes them question their value in the connection. That questioning leads to deeper internal reflection than any argument or explanation could. Silence also prompts them to revisit past interactions, replaying moments to understand when the shift happened. They may check in silently, viewing stories, lingering on conversations, or subtly watching from a distance. Curiosity isn't always loud or direct. Sometimes it hides behind quiet observation, delayed responses, or sudden interest in your energy after a period of inconsistency. The longer the silence holds, the more curiosity sharpens. Because humans naturally want resolution, not open loops. When access disappears, imagination replaces certainty. They might wonder if someone else has your attention, if you've emotionally detached, or if you saw their withdrawal as insignificant. That confusion becomes a quiet motivator. They might reappear not because they planned to, but because curiosity pulled them back. Without a word, ignoring can create questions that echo louder than any attempt to explain. Emotional distance can feel painful at first, but when the response to someone pulling away is silence rather than panic, an internal reset quietly begins. Ignoring isn't just about withholding communication, it's about removing your energy from a space where it wasn't being valued. That shift naturally creates room to breathe, reflect, and reclaim your emotional center. The noise of overthinking starts to quiet down when you stop chasing explanations and start choosing peace over reaction. Instead of trying to understand why someone stepped back, the focus gradually returns to where it always should have been: your own well-being. When you stop pouring effort into uncertainty, it becomes easier to see things clearly. Emotional clarity doesn't arrive in a rush. It shows up slowly, in moments where you realize you're no longer waiting for a message or rehearsing conversations in your head. The silence you choose becomes a boundary and a filter. It keeps you from negotiating with disrespect or inconsistency and instead rewires your mind to prioritize what actually feels safe and mutual. This kind of reset also strengthens self-worth. When attention is no longer chasing someone who checked out, confidence begins to rebuild itself naturally. There's power in choosing not to react, not because you don't feel anything, but because you finally understand that emotions don't need to be performed to be valid. With space comes perspective, and perspective shows you what you tolerated, what drained you, and what you no longer intend to accept. Ignoring also stops the emotional roller coaster before it spirals. When someone pulls away, it can trigger anxiety, fear of abandonment, or obsessive thinking. But silence interrupts that cycle. It tells your nervous system there is nothing to fix, nothing to beg for, nothing to chase. You start to detach not out of coldness, but out of self-preservation. And in that detachment, you rediscover parts of yourself that got dimmed while trying to understand someone else's distance. The reset isn't always comfortable. There may be days where you question your choice or feel the temptation to reach out. But the longer the silence holds, the more you see the emotional benefits. You sleep easier. You focus on yourself without apology. You stop overanalyzing their behavior and start listening to your own needs. Even the emotional sting fades faster when attention is reinvested inward rather than outward. What began as ignoring someone who stepped back becomes a quiet reclamation of power. You no longer operate from reaction. You operate from self-respect. The reset doesn't just restore balance. It teaches you that losing someone's attention is never as costly as losing yourself trying to keep it. Attraction doesn't always disappear when someone pulls away. Sometimes it goes dormant, waiting for a trigger. Ignoring becomes that unexpected trigger. When the usual reaction of chasing, questioning, or seeking closure is replaced with complete detachment, it creates an emotional contrast that can reignite interest in ways you don't have to force. Silence removes the pressure, the availability, and the validation they were used to receiving. That sudden lack of access often makes what was once familiar feel distant, and distance has a way of making people look again. Attraction isn't fueled by comfort alone. It feeds on unpredictability, mystery, and the feeling that something valuable might no longer be guaranteed. When your attention is no longer freely offered, it disrupts the ease they felt in pulling away. Suddenly, the absence feels bigger than the presence once did. They start to notice what's missing: your voice, your presence, your reactions, your energy. Ignoring replaces familiarity with curiosity, and curiosity often revives desire. There's also a psychological pull that occurs when someone realizes they're not being chased. Being pursued feeds ego, but being ignored activates something deeper, a sense of potential loss. Even if they didn't think much about pulling away in the first place, the silence forces them to reconsider the connection. They wonder if the door quietly closed on its own. They wonder if someone else has your attention. They wonder if they misread their importance. This silent questioning becomes the fuel for revived attraction. Another layer is contrast. When someone feels too certain of your interest, they don't feel urgency. Ignoring removes that certainty. You're no longer reacting, no longer asking, no longer trying. That shift from availability to silence creates space they didn't expect. In that space, attraction rebounds, not because you're trying to create it, but because you're no longer trying at all. Even small things start to gain meaning in your absence. They may recheck old conversations, linger on your posts, or subtly reappear just to test the waters. The desire to know if they still hold space in your life can quietly push them back into your orbit. The less you react, the more their mind fills the silence with possibilities they can't confirm. Ignoring does what chasing never could. It restores emotional magnetism. You stop sending energy, and by default, your absence becomes the loudest statement. Without confrontation, without reminders, without effort, the pull resets itself. They start noticing the void, and attraction grows not because you chased reassurance, but because you stopped offering it. Silence turns into gravity. Distance turns into intrigue, and the very act of letting go becomes the reason interest finds its way back. Silence is a way of exposing what words can hide. When someone pulls away and is met with no reaction, their true intentions start to surface without you having to ask a single question. Ignoring removes the emotional cushion they expected to fall back on. Instead of being pursued, comforted, or reassured, they're left with their own choices and whatever effort they're genuinely willing to make. That's where clarity begins. Because when attention is no longer guaranteed, only genuine interest has a reason to show up. If someone truly cared but was confused, overwhelmed, or unsure, silence becomes a mirror that makes them reflect. They start to question their own distance and may attempt to reconnect, explain, or re-engage in some way. Their actions, not their excuses, reveal where they stand. The pullback they initiated no longer gives them control when your energy is no longer there to support it. If they value the connection, they begin to take small or deliberate steps to revive it. Maybe a check-in, maybe a reappearance, maybe a shift in behavior. You don't chase the truth. It appears through what they do in your absence. On the other hand, if the interest was shallow or rooted in convenience, ignoring exposes that too. Some people only engage when attention is easy, when affection is accessible, or when validation is waiting on standby. When silence closes the door they were used to walking through without effort, those who had weak or selfish intentions simply drift further away. And that clarity is not a loss, it's a filter. Someone who vanishes when they're not fed attention was never going to stay when it mattered. Silence also strips away the gray areas. No overthinking, no decoding mixed signals, no debating motives. When there's no reaction from you, everything shifts to what they actually do next. Do they stay gone? Do they hover? Do they attempt to re-establish presence subtly or directly? Their instinctive response to being ignored says more than any explanation ever could. This is the moment where expectations break and truth steps in. Effort becomes the only language. Silence demands authenticity because there's no room left for comfortable inconsistency. If they cared only about control or validation, they feel frustrated, not reflective. If they cared about the connection itself, they feel a pull to restore it. You don't have to confront, prove, or persuade. Ignoring doesn't chase answers. It forces them to emerge on their own. And whatever rises from that space, action or absence, is the truth that was hiding behind words, excuses, and temporary interest. Silence doesn't just protect you, it reveals everything you need to know. Choosing silence instead of reaction isn't just about withholding communication. It's about setting a boundary without announcing it. When someone pulls away and you decide not to chase, it becomes an act of self-preservation and self-definition. That choice makes space for personal growth because your energy stops orbiting around uncertainty and starts centering back on you. Ignoring in this context is not avoidance. It's a redirection of emotional power. The moment you stop seeking validation from someone who withdrew, you begin validating yourself. You're no longer stuck wondering what changed or what you could do to fix it. Your focus shifts toward what you can control. Your mindset, your peace, your standards. That internal shift strengthens confidence in a way external reassurance never could. Even the discomfort of silence turns into fuel for self-awareness. You begin to see how much of your mental space was given to someone who didn't earn consistent access to it. Boundaries become clearer through inaction. Instead of explaining standards, you demonstrate them. You show that inconsistency doesn't get rewarded with attention. You show that distance doesn't trigger desperation. That calm detachment begins to redefine how you see yourself, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone deciding what is and isn't acceptable. And that mindset invites emotional maturity. You stop reacting emotionally to someone else's uncertainty and start responding only to what aligns with your self-respect. Growth also shows up in the silence between impulses. Where you might have once overthought, reached out, or tried to fix things, you now sit with your feelings instead of acting on them. That restraint builds resilience. You realize you don't crumble without their presence. You learn that peace isn't found in chasing answers, but in choosing not to exhaust yourself over someone else's indecision. Over time, ignoring becomes less about them and more about you. You begin shifting energy into things that feed you, goals, routines, relationships that reciprocate, a mindset that isn't destabilized by someone else's withdrawal. Emotional independence starts to feel natural, not forced. And with that independence comes clarity. You don't need to fight for space in someone else's world when you can build your own with intention. The boundary formed through silence protects your emotional capacity. You show yourself that you're not dependent on attention to feel valuable. And the growth that comes from that realization changes everything about how you respond to people in the future. Ignoring doesn't harden you, it refines you. It teaches you that walking away from uncertainty isn't loss, it's alignment. The strength gained in that silence becomes something you carry forward long after the person who pulled away stops mattering.